My name is Kayla Sinclair. I am 32 years old. 3 months ago, I flew across the country to attend my sister's wedding in Vail. When I arrived at the luxury lodge venue, my own parents blocked the glass terrace entrance and told me to leave. "Only family is allowed," my mom said. "You weren't invited." I stood there in the navy dress I had picked out, holding the engraved premium Swiss watch I had wrapped the night before on my hotel bed, and watched my mother's face show absolutely nothing. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. The alpine air at 9,000 feet doesn't just feel cold, it feels thin and clinical. Standing on the granite terrace of the Frozen Crest Lodge, every breath tasted like frozen pine and expensive wood smoke. Through the massive wall of glass, the grand ballroom looked blinding. I could smell the faint trace of vintage champagne leaking through the vents. Inside, the world was glowing in amber and gold. Outside, the temperature was dropping past freezing, and I was standing in a navy silk dress that suddenly felt like an explicit indictment of my own stupidity. I didn't let my hands shake. I didn't drop the premium Swiss watch inside the embossed box in my hand. Anger wasn't loud. It was metric. I watched the guests drift past the glass, completely enveloped in a production that my financial data architecture had systematically built. The eucalyptus garlands draped along the cedar beams, the crystal chandeliers reflecting off the floors. Every asset in that room existed because my credit lines had cleared the path months ago. I had been the silent investor in their version of family, funding the inventory of their happiness while remaining completely unlisted on the ledger. My mother, Stephanie, took a step closer, her champagne silk gown rustling. She didn't reach out. Her hands formed a physical barricade between my body and the door. Her voice was a low, venomous hiss designed to keep her manicured facade perfectly poised for the billionaire Mason family watching from the grand foyer. She told me that I needed to vanish immediately, before Catherine Mason looked out and realized the independent daughter from Manhattan had disrupted the script. They had told everyone I was locked in a corporate crisis across the country. My presence was a non-compliant data point in her carefully curated social climb. Behind her, my father, Douglas, stood entirely frozen. He looked like an empty shell, a man who had spent 35 years executing a policy of absolute passivity. He wouldn't lift his eyes to meet mine. He kept his gaze locked onto the tips of his polished shoes, his hands buried deep into his pockets, refusing to offer a single syllable of defense. He wasn't shocked by the erasure of his eldest daughter. He was simply terrified of the noise a confrontation might make. Stephanie glanced nervously over her shoulder, her jaw set like concrete. She whispered that Brianna's wedding to Caleb Mason was a historic merger of status, and that my sudden appearance was a liability they couldn't afford to explain. It was simpler if I just turned around and went back to the airport. I didn't blink. I rubbed my eyes mentally, trying to summon a breakdown, but there was only a spreadsheet taking shape in the dark. This wasn't a tragedy. It was a bad investment closing out. I didn't argue on that terrace. I didn't beg for entry. I walked back down the gravel path, entered my rental car, and drove straight back to my suite. The luxury navy silk dress was unzipped and left discarded on the floor like a bad investment. I pulled on a heavy slate gray corporate hoodie, sat at the edge of the mahogany desk, and flipped open my enterprise laptop. Inside, the screen cast a cold blue glow across the quiet room. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. It was a balance sheet waiting to be cleared. They wanted a pristine, drama-free milestone. They wanted a world where I didn't exist, where my independent life was a convenient fiction to feed the billionaire Masons. Fine, but you don't get to erase the architect and keep using her foundation. If I'm not family, my private wealth credit profile is no longer a family asset. My compassion had been a luxury resource they had overdrafted for years, treating my credit score like an infinite line of cash. Now, I realized our relationship had been a premium subscription with me footing the entire bill. I logged directly into my private wealth management portal and pulled up the master vendor agreements for the Frozen Crest Lodge. 4 contracts total, all signed with my digital credentials. I systematically reviewed the active balances. Lodge master catering contract, $26,000 revoked. Floral layout and artisanal labor, $14,000 revoked. High fashion styling and photography arrays, $37,000 revoked. With a single heavy strike on the execution key, I terminated the payment authorizations, legally redirecting a total outstanding balance of $77,000 directly to the event hosts. To ensure no automated retry sweeps could bypass the block, I called my private banking representative, authorizing an immediate security freeze on the primary accounts linked to those vendor portals. The $8,000 I had advanced for the initial deposits was gone, a non-refundable entry cost of learning a final lesson. But the remaining $77,000 would land on their doorstep by morning. This wasn't a malicious act of revenge, it was forensic accounting. Inside, my terminal glowed with a different kind of sunrise, the kind made entirely of metrics, numbers, and quiet retribution. As the confirmation screens loaded, I sat in the stillness and faced the question that had haunted me for a decade. Why did a successful, completely independent data architect keep signing these massive contracts for people who treated her like an unwanted ghost? The truth is, I had been bound by an invisible chain forged in my own childhood. When you are parentified at an early age, you are conditioned to believe your only value lies in what you can fix, what you can pay for, or what you can endure. Your boundaries become non-existent because you are trapped in a perpetual auction, desperately trying to purchase a scrap of love that should have been given freely. Writing those checks was my subconscious attempt to buy an empty seat at my own family's table. But standing on that terrace, looking at my mother's frozen face, the spiderweb of illusion finally shattered. The chain didn't just crack, it vanished. I didn't need to purchase a seat anymore. I was ready to build my own table. By Sunday morning, the digital fallout from my financial withdrawal had completely ignited. My phone didn't just ring, it vibrated against the glass nightstand with a persistent, erratic aggression that felt like a localized tremor. The family tree wasn't seeking an explanation. It was activating a defensive perimeter. They weren't calling to ask why I had been left outside on the freezing mountain terrace. They were calling because their proxy credit line had evaporated, leaving their high society aspirations directly exposed to the cold metrics of reality. Brianna's text messages arrived first, landing in rapid successions of weaponized panic. "Kayla, stop being an absolute child," the screen read. "Mom didn't mean it that way on the terrace." It was an incredibly high-pressure social situation with Catherine Mason. You are completely overreacting and trying to ruin the happiest milestone of my entire life over a stupid misunderstanding. The lodge is threatening to lock our master's suites and hold our luxury luggage. Transfer the $77,000 back immediately or you are dead to this family. I didn't type a response. I archived every line of text, like incoming error logs. 20 minutes later, my mother, Stephanie, launched her secondary counterstrike, moving the conflict into the public arena. A notification popped up on my social feed. It was a heavily filtered family portrait taken inside the grand foyer. There stood Douglas, Stephanie, Brianna, Caleb, and the billionaire Mason matriarch, locked in a flawless display of synchronized prestige. One family joined, one daughter missing. The caption beneath the image was clinical in its passive-aggressive execution. Stephanie had written, "Some children grow up, move to the city, and completely forget the sacrifices that built their wings. True family stands together through thick and thin, but selfishness destroys foundations. Praying for peace." Within minutes, extended relatives began liking the post, cementing the narrative that I was the malicious variable attempting to sabotage my sister's milestone. Monitoring the digital onslaught, I realized a profound truth about the mechanics of my family. They didn't feel a single shred of guilt because they had spent decades thoroughly normalizing their own cruelty. Within a narcissistic family ecosystem, the exploitation of the responsible child is treated as standard operational policy. They genuinely believe my sole purpose was to underwrite the contracts, absorb the liability, and then evaporate quietly so their social image could remain untarnished. In their minds, my sudden enforcement of a baseline personal boundary wasn't an act of self-defense. It was an unreasonable attack on their right to use me. They had normalized the abuse so deeply that they viewed my refusal to be financially strip-mined as an act of ultimate betrayal. They weren't shocked by the cruelty of erasing me on that terrace. They were simply outraged that the cash cow had finally stopped playing along. I checked out of the lodge room before dawn, trading the suffocating alpine altitude of Vail for the brutal, familiar rhythm of Manhattan. I didn't send a parting text, and I didn't issue an emotional ultimatum. By Monday morning, I was sitting inside a sleek midtown corporate office, the New York skyline cutting sharply through the floor-to-ceiling glass. The room smelled of strong espresso and raw paper, an environment governed entirely by logic, data, and verifiable facts. I had left the emotional arena completely. I had spent 32 years believing that family required unconditional compliance, but that illusion was left on the Colorado mountainside. If you treat a toxic family like an emotional sanctuary, they will slowly incinerate your identity. But if you treat them like a non-compliant corporate entity, the parameters become clear, cold, and entirely manageable. Sitting across the glass desk from me was Aunt Valerie. At 65 years old, she was the only branch of the Sinclair tree that had completely detached itself from my mother's image-driven architecture. Valerie was fiercely independent and held the physical possession of our family's historical estate records. She placed a heavy leather portfolio on the desk, her sharp eyes narrowing as she took a slow sip of black coffee. She didn't offer me an empty cliché, and she didn't tell me to forgive my parents for the sake of peace. Instead, her voice cut through the quiet room with the clinical weight of a scalpel. She told me that Stephanie had been rewriting reality since the day she married my father, systematically utilizing his conflict-avoidant passivity to build an illusion of high society security they could never genuinely afford. Valerie left no room for doubt that my parents were spiraling. The Alpine Lodge vendors had already started flagging the processing accounts, issuing automated alerts, and threatening to halt the delivery of the high fashion registries and floral design networks. My family was spiraling in Colorado, but Valerie wasn't interested in the wedding crossfire. She told me we needed to track a far more dangerous metric. For the past 12 months, she had been quietly monitoring a series of unusual transaction entries within the liquidation logs of my late grandmother's commercial estate. Something in the master ledgers didn't balance, and she knew exactly which signatures had authorized the shift. I recruited a forensic estate auditor, a high-level specialist who spent his career dissecting corporate asset fraud. Together, we bypassed the emotional noise and initiated a comprehensive, systemic review of every financial account, property deed, and transfer ledger linked to my credentials over the past 48 months. My family assumed that my independent life in Manhattan meant I was too distracted to look back. They thought my data architecture salary meant I would simply absorb their systemic financial usage without reviewing the underlying code. But metrics do not lie, and data leaves a permanent, unforgiving trail. Every digital footprint and every secondary ledger sweep leaves a record. We executed the forensic audit block, pulling 48 months of historical account sheets, completely ready to expose the literal depth of their deception. Valerie's months of quiet preparation paid off when the forensic audit reached its final, definitive breakthrough at exactly 2 o'clock on Tuesday afternoon. The atmosphere inside the Midtown office didn't just shift, it completely froze. A high-resolution scan of an official estate document filled the secondary monitor, casting a sharp, white light across the glass desk. The data didn't leave room for emotional interpretation. It laid out a cold pattern of systematic theft that completely cleared away any remaining traces of my familial obligation. This wasn't family drama anymore. This was an unhedged asset strip. Aunt Valerie pointed a pen at the file header. The document was a hidden authorization waiver for the Sinclair Boutique Design Hub. It was a commercial property asset left explicitly and solely to me by my late grandmother. My parents had spent years telling me the property was caught in an unresolvable probate freeze, a dormant holding that yielded zero return. But the active transaction logs told an entirely different story. The asset had been liquidated exactly 48 days after my sister announced her engagement. I leaned into the monitor, my eyes tracking the digital signature field at the bottom of the page. There it was, my name, written in an elegant, flowing script, Kayla Sinclair, but the geometric metrics were entirely artificial. The loop on the first letter was too wide. The slant on the final characters lacked the standard pressure profile of my actual handwriting. It was a complete signature mismatch, a calculated professional forgery, executed by the very people who had demanded my absolute loyalty. The forensic auditor pulled up the cross-ledger reports, linking the tracking data directly to the master wedding contracts I had co-signed out of a misplaced sense of duty. My parents had covertly slipped a forged asset transfer authorization alongside the digital bundle of those high society design agreements. They used my leaked personal security credentials to bypass verification and authorize the liquidation, masking the fraud behind the noise of the wedding infrastructure. They had systematically siphoned $40,000 from my private inheritance, transferring the liquidated capital directly into Brianna's custom high-fashion trousseau and luxury wardrobe array. They didn't just expect me to underwrite their high society performance. They were actively siphoning the foundation of my independent security to build a fraudulent stage for the golden child. My compassion hadn't just been overdrafted. It had been criminally exploited. My mother hadn't simply left me outside on that terrace to protect a social lie. She had barred me from the room because my presence was a living threat to the financial crime she had just executed under my name. Valerie closed the portfolio with a heavy, definitive snap. The legal team immediately finalized the master forensic declaration, attaching the certified forensic signature verification report and the transaction sequence logs. We compiled the complete data package, formatting it with the absolute precision of a criminal indictment. They thought their high society connection to the Masons insulated them from accountability. But they had handed me the exact weapon needed to dismantle their entire matrix. The felony fraud notices were logged in process. There was no path left for reconciliation, no room for excuses, and no turning back. The Midtown rain was tapping against the glass windows of my Manhattan office on Thursday morning, a cold, rhythmic sound that matched the absolute clarity inside the room. My desk terminal was clear, completely scrubbed of emotional static. Then, the secondary line began to ring. The flashing caller ID didn't say mother. It displayed a direct automated line from a panicked family unit facing immediate systemic bankruptcy. I let it cycle 3 times, watching the digital indicator pulse against the glass desk before I picked up, my posture perfectly straight, my breathing entirely normal. Stephanie's voice hit the line like ragged glass, completely stripped of the honey-warm poise she had manufactured on the Vale Terrace. The high society cadence was dead, replaced by the naked panic of a cornered debtor. She didn't call me a troubled family acquaintance this time. She gasped out my name like an unhedged lifeline. She skyrocketed the tension when she explained that Catherine Mason had uncovered the entire rerouted vendor fee deployment. The billionaire matriarch had immediately canceled the secondary commercial asset partnership with my father, a catastrophic loss that permanently shattered their business security. The credit card network had frozen their primary banking accounts due to my fraud report, and the lodge was threatening an immediate civil lawsuit against their home. She wept openly over the line, a sloppy, theatrical display that held zero real remorse. Brianna's new high society circle was in absolute ruins, the debt notices circulating through the country club grapevine like a viral infection. Stephanie explained that they didn't have the $77,000. They had been forced to sign a predatory, high-interest personal asset loan just to pause the immediate court filings. "Kayla, please," she begged, her breath hitching into the microphone. "The underwriters are threatening to liquidate our remaining assets if you don't withdraw your fraud report. We are losing everything. Do something for your sister. We are your family." I adjusted my headset, my face remaining completely impassive as I viewed the transaction ledgers on my auxiliary display. Anger wasn't loud. It was an executed audit. I told her that when she stood on the glass terrace in Vale and called her firstborn daughter a troubled acquaintance to protect a fraudulent social image, she had officially terminated our relational contract. She had looked a stranger in the eye and declared to a room of 300 people that I did not exist. Now, the literal invoice for that performance had arrived, and I was simply balancing the ledger. She tried to scream to launch the final weaponized guilt grenade about my father's blood pressure, but the architecture of her manipulation was entirely worthless now. I calmly stated that I had just forwarded the certified forensic signature forgery reports directly to their predatory loan underwriters and the Mason family estate attorneys. They wanted an elite, drama-free merger, but I had handed them a legally precise execution. They weren't shocked by the fraud they had committed. They were simply crushed that I had refused to finance it. I disconnected the line with a clinical click and blocked their operational data codes permanently. 6 months have passed since that freezing Saturday afternoon at the Frozen Crest Lodge in Vail. The financial and legal dust has completely settled, leaving a landscape of absolute clarity. Brianna and Caleb are now locked into a grueling, high-interest personal loan repayment schedule that systematically drains their monthly social lifestyle budget. The fairytale alpine wedding has been permanently replaced by a monthly payment voucher. The billionaire Mason family completely withdrew from the secondary commercial partnerships, leaving Douglas and Stephanie socially isolated and forced to downsize their property to clear the forensic legal liabilities we uncovered. They had to make full civil restitution to the financial institution to prevent the fraud division from referring the forged signatures for state felony prosecution. I sit by the massive window of my Manhattan apartment on a quiet Sunday morning, holding a warm cup of matcha tea. The space is flooded with sunlight, architectural plants, and something I haven't felt in 32 years. Complete, unburdened silence. The wedding gown my sister wore is likely packed away in a cardboard box, covered in dust, a silent monument to a social lie that collapsed under the weight of its own metrics. I don't feel a single drop of malice, anger, or vindication. I simply feel an overwhelming sense of peace. They built their lives on an architecture of appearances, and when the proxy foundation was removed, the entire structure fell under its own gravity. I've come to realize that setting a radical personal boundary is never an act of punishment. It is not a weapon, and it is not a declaration of war. It is an act of ultimate self-preservation. We are conditioned by a compliant society to believe that forgiveness requires you to continuously show up, write the checks, and accept being erased for the comfort of a toxic family unit. We call it duty. We call it family. We call it being the bigger person. But every time you swallow an insult, ignore an exclusion, or allow your resources to be strip-mined to maintain a fraudulent image of harmony, you lose a little piece of your own soul. If you find yourself in a similar situation, remember that you do not owe an exploitative bloodline your identity. True family shows up, true family protects, and true family sacrifices. Biological connection is a matter of DNA, but safety and respect are matters of choice. Severing ties with the people who ground you down isn't a betrayal of them. It is a profound declaration of loyalty to yourself. You cannot build a meaningful, independent future if you are continuously financing the individuals who are covertly digging your own grave. My freedom cost a non-refundable deposit and a trip across the country, and I do not regret a single penny I refuse to pay. If you are the child who always pays emotionally, financially, or spiritually for a seat at a table that was never built with a chair for you, stop writing the checks. Stop waiting for an apology that will never come from people who refuse to see their own cruelty. Stand up, walk out of the room, and build your own table. Sit at the head of it. You are entirely worth the weight of your own freedom. I didn't lose my family that day on the Alpine terrace. I found myself, and honestly, she was worth the wait. If this journey touched a boundary you've been hesitant to draw in your own life, hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and share this video with someone who needs the courage to stand tall today. I'll see you in the comments.